The house smelled of rosemary, butter, and false warmth. Outside, late November wind dragged golden leaves across the manicured lawn of the large colonial home in Fairfield. Inside, crystal glasses chimed gently as 10 well. Rest guests gathered around a polished oak dining table long enough to seat a small board of directors. At the head of the table sat Daniel, my son-in-law, carving the turkey like a king dividing conquered land. My daughter, Melissa, floated beside him in a silk blouse the color of champagne, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't quite funny. And at the far end of the table sat me, Eleanor Whitmore, widow, mother, apparently, as I would soon learn, a freeloader. I had woken up at 5 that morning to prepare the stuffing the way Melissa used to love when she was little extra sage. No onions because she used to pick them out. I ironed my only cream blouse. I even curled my thinning gray hair with trembling fingers, hoping to look presentable among Daniel's country club friends. This house had once been my pride. I had sold my own after my husband Thomas passed, telling myself it was practical to move in temporarily. Melissa had insisted. "Mom, we have plenty of space, and we want you close," she had said, holding my hands, her eyes soft. That was 3 years ago. The dining room sparkled with gold-trimmed plates. Candlelight flickered against the glass cabinet behind me. I could see my reflection faintly in the china display, small, quiet, already fading. Dinner had just been served. Laughter rolled down the table as Daniel told a story about closing a deal with a pharmaceutical supplier. A few guests nodded in admiration. One of them, a tall woman with sharp red lipstick, asked me politely, "And what do you do, Eleanor?" Before I could answer, Melissa smiled sweetly. "Oh, Mom's retired," she said. "She mostly keeps busy around the house. Mostly keeps busy around the house." The words stung more than they should have. I had paid half the down payment for this house. I had covered Daniel's business losses when his investment venture failed 2 years ago. I babysat their children 3 nights a week. I cooked, cleaned, drove, helped, but I smiled gently. "Yes," I said, "I suppose I do." The first sign something was wrong came when Daniel stood up mid-meal. He tapped his fork against his wine glass. "Before dessert," he announced, grinning, "I think we should address something." The room quieted. Melissa's smile shifted, too rehearsed, too sharp. Daniel disappeared into the kitchen. There was nervous laughter. Someone assumed it was a game, a holiday joke. He returned carrying a metal bucket, not decorative, not festive, a plain, dented, silver bucket. At first, I thought perhaps it was part of a Thanksgiving skit. Some modern joke I didn't understand. Then the smell reached me, mashed potatoes, turkey scraps, gravy, cranberry sauce, all mixed together into a grayish, lumpy paste. The bucket was set directly in front of me. The sound it made when it touched the table echoed louder than it should have. My hands froze in my lap. Daniel clasped his hands together theatrically. "Well," he said, "we figured since some people contribute differently around here." A few guests chuckled uncertainly. Melissa leaned back in her chair, lifted her wine glass, and looked straight at me. "Now this," she said brightly, "is what your food will look like, freeloader." The word hit harder than the smell. "Freeloader." The room fell into a suffocating silence. One guest gasped softly. Another looked down immediately. A fork clinked against porcelain. The red lipstick woman blinked, unsure whether to laugh. My ears rang. I felt every eye on me, waiting for me to cry, to argue, to defend myself, but humiliation is a strange thing. It doesn't always arrive in flames. Sometimes it arrives as ice. I looked down at the bucket. Steam rose faintly from the mess inside it. It looked like something you'd pour into a trough. I remembered feeding pigs on my grandfather's farm when I was a little girl. I remembered Thomas's laugh when we burned our first Thanksgiving turkey as newlyweds. I remembered Melissa at 6 years old, sitting at our small kitchen table, swinging her legs and saying, "Mommy, your stuffing is better than Grandma's." Somewhere between those memories and this moment, I had become a burden. Daniel spread his arms. Come on, Eliner, it's just a joke. A joke. My daughter didn't look at me with guilt. She looked at me with irritation, as if I were the one making things uncomfortable by sitting there silently. You always say you don't need much, Melissa added, so we simplified things. Laughter flickered awkwardly around the table, thin and brittle. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. My first instinct was to apologize. For what? I didn't know. For aging, for surviving my husband, for not dying conveniently before becoming inconvenient. Instead, I placed my napkin carefully beside my plate. I stood, the chair legs scraped softly against hardwood. I'm sorry, I said gently. I must not be very hungry tonight. My voice did not shake. That seemed to disappoint them. I turned and walked toward the hallway. Each step felt measured, deliberate. Dignity is sometimes the only thing you have left, and you guard it like fragile glass. As I passed the mirror in the corridor, I caught my reflection again. Small, gray, quiet, but not broken. Behind me, conversation slowly resumed. Laughter forced at first, then louder, relieved. Relieved that I hadn't caused a scene. In my room, the guest room that had once been Daniel's home office, I closed the door softly. I sat on the edge of the bed. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel it, the crack in my chest, the ache behind my eyes. The word repeating like a drumbeat, freeloader, freeloader, freeloader. I opened the small closet. My suitcase sat on the top shelf, still dusty from when I moved in temporarily. 3 years. Temporary, I pulled it down. The zipper sounded louder than the laughter echoing faintly from the dining room. I folded my cream blouse, placed it inside, then my sweater, my shoes, my photographs of Thomas. There is a moment when humiliation turns into clarity. Mine arrived as I held the framed picture of Melissa at her college graduation, the ceremony I paid for when she had almost dropped out. I realized something quietly devastating. They thought I needed them. That was their mistake. By the time dessert was served, my suitcase was packed. By the time coffee was poured, I had written a short note and placed it neatly on the bedside table. Asterisk, thank you for the hospitality. I would not want to burden you further. Asterisk, no anger, no accusation, just truth. I waited until the guests began gathering coats. The front door opened and closed several times amid cheerful goodbyes. Then, while the house was distracted, I wheeled my suitcase down the hallway. Melissa saw me near the foyer. She frowned. Mom, what are you doing? Leaving. I replied calmly. Daniel appeared behind her, wine glass still in hand. Oh, come on, don't be dramatic. It was a joke. I looked at him steadily. Jokes are meant to make everyone laugh, I said. For the first time, he had no immediate response. Melissa crossed her arms. You're overreacting. Perhaps, I said softly. I opened the door. Cold night air rushed in, sharp and honest. As I stepped outside, I heard one of the guests whisper, "Is she really going?" The door closed behind me before I could hear the answer. The driveway lights flickered on automatically, illuminating the path to my car. The modest sedan still registered in my name. I placed the suitcase in the trunk. My hands did not tremble. When I started the engine, I looked once at the house. The house I had helped buy. The house where I had cooked every Thanksgiving meal until tonight. Through the dining room window, I could see shadows moving. Glasses lifting, life continuing. They believed the evening would end there. They believed I would cool off and return. They believed humiliation had no consequence. As I drove away into the November dark, I felt something unexpected settle inside me. Not grief, not rage, something quieter, decision, because what they did not know was that tomorrow would not be like tonight. And by this time next year, they would remember this Thanksgiving for a very different reason. The hotel room smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and old carpet. It was not grand, not polished oak and crystal and curated centerpieces. Just a modest bedspread in a faded burgundy pattern, a humming heater beneath the window, and a small lamp that flickered once before steadying itself. I had stayed in far worse places, but I had never felt so awake. I sat on the edge of the mattress, my suitcase open beside me, Thomas's photograph resting on the nightstand. The silence pressed against my ears, unfamiliar after years of living in someone else's noise. For a long time, I simply stared at my hands. These hands had kneaded dough before sunrise, had packed school lunches, had held my husband's fingers in a sterile hospital room as the machines slowed. These hands had signed checks, large ones. I could still remember the day Daniel had come to me, voice tight, confidence cracked. "It's temporary, Eleanor." He had said, not calling me Mom that day. The market shifted. Investors pulled out. I just need a bridge. I had written him one for $180,000. Temporary. When Melissa and Daniel found the colonial house in Fairfield, they had been ecstatic, but short on the down payment. "We're so close," Melissa had said, eyes shining. "Just a little more." I had sold the house Thomas and I built together. Every rose bush, every memory, I told myself it was practical. I told myself family is an investment you never regret. And technically, the house was in their names, but the funds had moved through my attorney, structured carefully, protected quietly because Thomas had always told me, "Be generous, Ellie, but never be foolish." I reached for my phone. It was 10:43 p.m., late but not too late. I scrolled to a number I had not called in months, Margaret Lawson. My attorney, my friend. The phone rang twice. Eleanor, her voice was sharp, alert. "Is everything all right?" I took a breath. "No," I said calmly, "but it will be." There was a pause. She knew that tone. "Tell me." I did not describe the bucket. I did not repeat the word freeloader. I simply said, "I am ready to review everything, the house agreement, the business loan, the trust." Silence hummed on the other end. "You're certain?" Margaret asked carefully. "Yes. You understand what that means." "I do." Another pause. Then softly, "What happened?" I closed my eyes. They forgot who built their foundation. Margaret exhaled slowly. "I'll start drafting documents first thing in the morning. But Eleanor, this will be swift. It needs to be, because Daniel's bridge loan had not been a gift. It had been a secured loan callable upon notice, because the additional funds for the house had not been a donation. They had been placed as a silent lien and the grandchildren's education trust, fully revocable. Melissa had never cared to read the details. Why would she? She believed I was harmless, old, dependent. I hung up the phone and leaned back against the headboard. For the first time that evening the tears came, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet streams sliding into my hairline. I was not grieving the house. I was grieving the illusion that love could not sour, the illusion that sacrifice guaranteed gratitude. But grief is a doorway, and on the other side of mine stood clarity. I rose and walked to the window. Outside, the parking lot was nearly empty. A flickering streetlight cast long shadows across asphalt. Somewhere across town, Melissa was likely irritated. "She's being dramatic," she would tell Daniel. "She'll be back in the morning." Daniel would shrug. "She has nowhere else to go." That assumption almost made me smile. Because they had never asked what remained in my accounts. They had never asked what Thomas left behind beyond the visible. They had never asked what a woman who survived 40, 3 years of marriage, 2 miscarriages, bankruptcy in our early 30s, and widowhood might be capable of. They saw gray hair. They did not see strategy. I returned to the bed and pulled a leather folder from my suitcase. Yes, I had packed it deliberately. Inside were copies of every major financial document from the past 5 years. I spread them across the blanket. The loan agreement to Daniel's company, signed, notarized, due on demand. The secondary funding contract tied to the house purchase, activated upon breach of family cohabitation agreement, and what legally constituted breach. Hostile living conditions, documentable humiliation. There had been cameras in the dining room. Daniel installed them for security. Margaret would know how to request footage. I stared at the paperwork until something inside me hardened, not cruelly, but firmly. This was not revenge born of rage. This was correction. There is a difference. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. Melissa. I let it ring. It rang again, Voicemail notification. I listened. Mom, seriously. You left in the middle of Thanksgiving. Everyone thinks you're upset. It was a joke. You can't just storm off like that. Call me. No apology, not even curiosity about where I was. Just inconvenience. I placed the phone face down. If I answered tonight, I would still be the woman at the end of the table. Tomorrow, I would be something else. I lay down fully clothed, staring at the ceiling's faint cracks. Thomas's voice drifted through memory. You taught her to be strong, Ellie. Perhaps I had, but strength without humility becomes cruelty. And cruelty, unchecked, must eventually meet consequence. At 2:17 a.m., I finally slept. When I woke at dawn, something had shifted inside me. The ache was still there, but it no longer ruled me. I made coffee in the small machine provided by the hotel. It tasted thin and slightly bitter. I drank it anyway at 8:03 a.m. My phone rang. Margaret, it's in motion, she said. Her efficiency steadied me. The loan will be formally called by noon. The lien enforcement notice will be delivered to the residence. Bank notifications will follow. There will be a 30-day window, but the freeze will be immediate, and the trust suspended pending review. I nodded slowly. Thank you, Eleanor, she added gently. This will shock them. Yes, I replied. It will. There was another pause. Are you all right? I looked around the modest room, at the suitcase, at the rising sun pushing pale light through thin curtains. Yes, I said truthfully, for the first time in a while. When we ended the call, I felt something unexpected bloom beneath the steel of my decision. Sadness. Because I had not wanted this, I would have preferred gratitude, a simple apology, a plate set in front of me like everyone else. But they had chosen spectacle, and spectacle demands response. I dressed carefully in a navy coat Thomas once said made me look formidable. I brushed my hair, applied lipstick for the first time in months, not for them, for myself. By the time I stepped outside the hotel and into the crisp morning air, legal machinery was already moving. Across town, perhaps Melissa was pouring coffee, assuming the worst had passed. Perhaps Daniel was checking emails casually. Perhaps they were laughing at how sensitive I had been. By afternoon, they would not be laughing. As I walked toward my car, I felt neither villainous nor triumphant, only steady. The night had stripped something from me. But it had also returned something I had forgotten I possessed, authority. And by the time the sun reached its highest point, they would finally understand the woman they mocked at the end of the table was the one holding the entire table up. At 9:12 a.m., the doorbell rang. Melissa was still in her silk pajamas, scrolling through her phone at the kitchen island. Daniel stood at the espresso machine, irritated that it wasn't heating fast enough. Neither of them expected consequence to arrive before coffee. The bell rang again, sharp, insistent. Daniel muttered under his breath and walked to the door. On the porch stood a man in a gray coat holding a leather folder. Daniel Whittaker, he asked. Yes, you've been served. He handed over a thick envelope and stepped back without another word. Daniel frowned, already annoyed. What is this? Behind him, Melissa leaned over his shoulder. Who is it? Before Daniel could answer, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. Another man stepped out, and then another. Melissa's stomach tightened. Within minutes, 3 separate envelopes sat on the marble entryway table. Daniel tore the first one open. His face shifted. What the hell? Melissa grabbed the second envelope. Her eyes moved across the page quickly, then again slower. No, she whispered. The documents were clinical. Precise, cold. Asterisk asterisk notice of loan acceleration. Asterisk asterisk the $180,000 bridge loan was being called in full, effective immediately. Failure to remit payment would result in asset seizure and legal proceedings. Daniel's jaw flexed. This is insane. It's family. Melissa opened the third envelope. Her fingers began to shake. Asterisk asterisk lien enforcement notification. Asterisk asterisk the house, their house, the one they hosted dinner in last night. The one they laughed in, the one they mocked her in, The down payment Elinor had provided had never been a gift. It had been secured, structured, legally protected, and the clause had been triggered. Melissa felt the room tilt. "This can't be real," she said faintly. As if summoned by panic, Daniel's phone buzzed, a notification from the bank. Asterisk, account activity alert. Asterisk, he opened the app, then went still. "What?" Melissa demanded. "Our operating account, it's frozen." "What do you mean frozen?" "I mean frozen." She snatched the phone from him. Across the screen, in neutral digital lettering, asterisk, temporary restriction, pending contractual review. Asterisk, Melissa's pulse pounded in her ears. At 9:37 a.m., the dining room camera pinged with a system notification. Footage accessed remotely under legal request. Daniel's face drained of color. "She wouldn't," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Across town, I sat by the hotel window with a cup of tea, watching sunlight climb steadily over the rooftops. Margaret had texted at 9:15. Asterisk, delivery confirmed. Asterisk, I closed my eyes briefly. I did not feel joy. I felt inevitability. My phone vibrated at 9:41. Melissa, I let it ring, then Daniel, then Melissa again. The third time I answered. "Yes," I said calmly. There was heavy breathing on the other end. "What is this?" Daniel demanded, skipping any greeting. "What did you do?" "I reviewed my investments." I replied, "Investments." Melissa's voice broke in. "Mom, the bank froze our account." "Yes, you can't just do that." "I can," I said softly, and I did. Silence. Then anger rushed in. "This is ridiculous," Daniel snapped. "It was a joke. You're destroying our lives over a joke." I thought of the bucket. Of 10 pairs of eyes watching. Of the word freeloader landing like spit. A joke, I repeated, is meant to amuse everyone. Melissa's voice trembled now, not with fury, but fear. "Mom, please, we have payroll Monday. The mortgage, I interrupted gently, is partially secured by me. That's not fair." I almost laughed at that. "Fair?" I asked quietly. The word hung between us. Through the phone, I could hear movement, papers shuffling, Daniel pacing, a cabinet door slamming. Guests from the night before were beginning to text. Asterisk, everything okay. Asterisk, we heard something strange this morning. Asterisk, word travels quickly in neighborhoods built on appearances. Daniel lowered his voice, attempting control. "What do you want?" There it was. Not apology, not remorse. "Terms. I want nothing." I said. "You already gave me clarity." Melissa inhaled sharply. "Mom, please, don't do this." "Do what?" I asked. "Free you from a freeloader." Her breath hitched. Finally, the word had weight. "You're being cruel." Daniel said. "No," I replied evenly. Cruelty is public humiliation. This is paperwork. In the background, another notification chimed. "The Education Trust suspended pending review." Melissa gasped. "No, Mom, not the kids. I would never harm my grandchildren." I said. "Their trust is secure, but it is mine to manage." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. His confidence. The polished dinner host, the man carving turkey at the head of the table, was gone. "What do we need to do?" he asked, voice quieter now. I looked out the window at the pale blue sky. "I will meet you tomorrow," I said, "with my attorney." "Attorney?" Melissa whispered, as if the word itself was a betrayal. "You taught me something last night," I continued. "Family is a flexible definition." There was a long pause. For the first time in years, they were listening. "I will not live where I am mocked." I said, "I will not fund those who ridicule me. If we are to have a relationship, it will be built on respect, not obligation." Daniel swallowed audibly. "And if we don't agree, then you will need to refinance the loan, satisfy the lien, and repay what is owed. You know we can't do that immediately." "I do." The truth of it made them go very quiet, because Daniel's business was still recovering, because most of their liquidity was tied up in lifestyle, because they had assumed security without understanding its source. Melissa's voice cracked. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell us?" "I assumed you knew," I said. And that was the most honest thing I had spoken all morning. When the call ended, I placed the phone beside me and allowed myself one long exhale. Across town, the Whittaker house felt colder. Melissa sat at the dining table, the same one from the night before, staring at the empty space where the bucket had been. Daniel stood by the window, watching neighbors' cars pass slowly, as if the world had shifted slightly off its axis. At 11:02 a.m., a final email arrived, a formal request for preserved video footage from Thanksgiving evening. Daniel's face went pale. He looked at Melissa. She's serious. Melissa's eyes filled. She's never looked at me the way she did when she walked out, she whispered. For the first time, the weight of what they had done settled fully in her chest, not just the legal consequences. The moral ones back at the hotel. I opened Thomas's photograph again. I didn't choose war. I murmured softly, "But sometimes dignity requires defense." And by noon, the truth had settled over that beautiful colonial house like a storm cloud. The woman they mocked at the table had just reminded them who owned the foundation beneath their feet. The knock on my hotel room door came at 7:14 the next morning, not timid, not aggressive, desperate. I had expected it. Margaret sat at the small writing desk near the window, reviewing documents with methodical calm. She had arrived an hour earlier, impeccably dressed, silver hair pinned neatly in place. If composure could be weaponized, she carried it effortlessly. The knock came again. I rose slowly and walked to the door. When I opened it, Melissa stood there. She looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but stripped of something. Her hair was pulled back carelessly. Her eyes were swollen, mascara faintly smudged beneath them. Behind her stood Daniel. He did not look like the man who carved the turkey 2 nights ago. He looked like someone who had glimpsed a cliff edge in the dark. "Mom," Melissa said, and her voice cracked on the single syllable. I stepped aside. "Come in." They entered the modest room, glancing briefly at the narrow bed, the suitcase near the wall, the simple lamp. The contrast between this space and their sprawling dining room was impossible to ignore. Margaret stood politely. "Mr. and Mrs. Whittaker," she greeted. Daniel stiffened slightly at the formality. Melissa's eyes landed on the folder in Margaret's hands. "Is all of this necessary?" she asked quietly. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, the same freckles across her nose she'd had at 7, the same nervous habit of pressing her lips together when overwhelmed. "It became necessary," I said gently. Silence stretched between us. Daniel cleared his throat. We overreacted. He began, the words sounding rehearsed. It was a holiday joke that went too far. I held his gaze. "A joke." I replied softly. "Requires mutual laughter." Melissa's shoulders trembled slightly. "Mom," I was embarrassed. She blurted suddenly. That surprised me. Embarrassed. I asked. She nodded quickly, tears spilling over. "You always correct Daniel. You question his investments. You reorganize the pantry after I do it, in front of people. It makes him look small." I finished. Daniel's jaw tightened. Melissa nodded miserably. "And humiliating you was meant to fix that?" I asked. Her breath hitched. "No," she whispered. I don't know what I was thinking. There it was, not pride. Not negotiation, but something rawer, regret. Margaret remained silent, observing. Daniel finally spoke again, his tone less defensive now. "We're under pressure, Elinor. The business is still fragile. Investors watch everything. We needed to project stability. And mocking your wife's mother accomplished that." Margaret asked coolly. Daniel had no answer. Melissa stepped forward. "When you stood up from that table," she said shakily, "I felt something drop in my stomach, but I didn't chase you. I didn't stop you." Her voice broke completely. "I'm so sorry." The words filled the small room, not grand, not eloquent, but real. I felt the steel inside me soften, but not disappear. "Apology is not erasure, it is acknowledgement. I gave you everything I could," I said quietly, "not because you owed me, but because I loved you." Melissa nodded through tears. "I know. You mistook generosity for dependency." That landed. Daniel's posture shifted. We were wrong, he admitted, voice low. Margaret closed her folder gently. The current actions can be paused, she said calmly, provided we reach an agreement today. Melissa looked up quickly. An agreement, yes, I said. I moved to the small table and sat. They followed. I do not want your ruin, I began. I want respect. Daniel exhaled slowly. What does that look like? First, I said a formal written acknowledgement that the loan remains valid and will be repaid under structured terms. No more assumptions. He nodded. Second, the house lien remains until repayment is complete. I will not be mocked under a roof partially secured by me. Another nod? Less comfortable, but accepting. Third, I continued, turning to Melissa, if I am ever invited to your table again, it will be as family, not charity. Tears slid silently down her cheeks. You will always be family, she whispered. Family behaves accordingly. Silence. Then Daniel surprised me. You're right, he said plainly. I was threatened by you. The honesty in his voice was almost startling. You're sharper than I realized, and instead of respecting that, I resented it. Margaret raised an eyebrow slightly, impressed. Melissa squeezed Daniel's hand. I forgot who you were before you became just Mom living with us, she said to me. That phrase lingered, just Mom living with us. Invisible roles are dangerous things. I studied them carefully. They looked shaken, but not shattered. Humbled, but not destroyed. Good. Revenge that annihilates leaves only emptiness. Revenge that corrects, restores balance. Margaret slid the revised documents across the table. Structured repayment. Clear boundaries, mutual acknowledgement. Daniel signed first, then Melissa. When the pen reached me, I paused briefly, not from doubt, but from awareness. This moment would define the future of our relationship. I signed. Margaret gathered the papers efficiently. I'll file the revisions this afternoon, she said. Account restrictions will lift once confirmations are processed. Daniel exhaled deeply, relief flooding his face. Melissa looked at me cautiously. Will you come home? Home, the word felt different now. I will not move back in, I said gently. Her expression flickered with pain. I need my own space. I continued. I sold my house for you once. I won't do that again. Daniel nodded slowly. That's fair. I've already placed an offer on a small cottage near Lake Harmon. I added. Melissa blinked. You have. I woke up early. A faint, almost reluctant smile touched Daniel's mouth. For the first time since Thanksgiving, the tension in the room eased. Melissa stepped forward hesitantly. Can I hug you? I opened my arms. She collapsed into them like she had as a child. Warm, trembling, human. I held her, not as a woman who had won, but as a mother who had drawn a line. Daniel approached more cautiously. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I know. I replied. Forgiveness is not forgetfulness. It is decision. When they left the hotel room an hour later, their faces still pale but steadier, I stood by the window and watched them walk to their car. They did not look powerful. They looked thoughtful, good. Later that week, I signed the papers for my cottage. Small, white shutters, a porch swing overlooking quiet water. Mine. On the following Thanksgiving, a year later, the table looked different. Smaller, warmer. Melissa set my plate personally. Daniel poured my wine, and when he raised his glass, he said clearly, without performance to Elena, the strongest foundation we know. There was no bucket, only gratitude. And though they would never forget the morning their world turned pale with fear, they would remember something else more vividly. Respect, once demanded with grace, has a way of lasting longer than humiliation ever could.